for years. One of the biggest decisions for PC users who wanted to experience both Windows and Linux was whether to dual boot their computer. You either installed Windows first and then Linux, or carefully partitioned your drive, configured the boot, and hoped that a future Windows update wouldn't overwrite everything. Dual booting became almost a rite of passage for Linux enthusiasts. It was a symbol of freedom, experimentation, and sometimes frustration. But something interesting has been happening over the last few years, and many people haven't even noticed it. Windows and Linux, once considered bitter rivals, are slowly becoming partners. The line separating the two operating systems is becoming increasingly blurred. The question is no longer whether Linux can replace Windows or whether Windows can beat Linux. Instead, the real question is whether we are entering an era where the two systems quietly merge into one seamless computing experience, making traditional dual booting unnecessary. If we travel back 20 years, Windows and Linux lived in completely different worlds. Windows dominated desktops, offices, gaming, and consumer software, while Linux powered servers, supercomputers, networking equipment, and later smartphones through Android. Microsoft famously referred to Linux as a threat. Running Linux software on Windows was difficult, and running Windows applications on Linux usually required compatibility tools like Wine, which rarely worked perfectly. Switching between the two operating systems meant rebooting your computer every single time. Fast forward to today, and the situation looks dramatically different. One of the biggest turning points came in 2016 when Microsoft introduced the Windows Subsystem for Linux, commonly known as WSL at first. Many Linux users dismissed it as another attempt by Microsoft to keep developers locked into Windows. However, WSL quickly evolved into something surprisingly powerful. Instead of emulating Linux, Microsoft created an environment where genuine Linux tools could run directly inside Windows. Developers suddenly had access to Bash, SSH, Python, GCC, Git, and thousands of Linux packages without leaving Windows. Then came WSL2, which was an even bigger leap. Rather than simply translating Linux system calls, Microsoft integrated a real Linux kernel into Windows using lightweight virtualization. This meant near-native Linux performance while still using Windows as the primary operating system. Docker containers became faster. Development environments became easier to manage, and programmers no longer needed to maintain separate Linux installations for many tasks. The changes didn't stop there. Microsoft began working directly with the Linux community. The Linux kernel used in WSL is maintained by Microsoft itself and receives regular updates. The company contributes code to the Linux kernel, supports open source projects on GitHub, and even developed applications like Visual Studio Code with first-class Linux support. Ironically, one of the world's largest contributors to open source software is now Microsoft, a company that once viewed Linux as its biggest competitor. At the same time, Linux has also become better at interacting with Windows. Modern Linux distributions can easily access Windows, partitions, share files across networks, mount NTFS drives with excellent compatibility, and even run certain Windows applications through improved compatibility layers. Projects like Proton, developed by Valve, allow thousands of Windows games to run on Linux with remarkable performance. While Linux users once dreamed of escaping Windows completely, today many simply use whichever tools work best regardless of the operating system underneath. Cloud computing has accelerated this convergence even further. Companies no longer care whether developers use Windows, Linux, or Mac OS, as long as applications can be deployed consistently. Most servers run Linux, but many developers write code on Windows, services like Docker, Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, and cloud platforms such as Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud are designed to work across operating systems. In this environment, operating systems have become platforms rather than isolated ecosystems. Perhaps the clearest sign of this shift is Microsoft's own Azure cloud platform. The majority of virtual machines running on Azure are Linux. Microsoft earns billions of dollars supporting Linux workloads. Instead of trying to eliminate Linux, Microsoft profits from helping businesses run Linux more efficiently. This business reality has changed the company's entire strategy. Supporting Linux is no longer optional. It is essential. A software engineer can now open Windows, launch a Linux terminal in seconds, edit code using Visual Studio Code, compile applications with Linux toolchains, test them in Docker containers, and deploy them to Linux servers without ever rebooting the computer. 10 years ago, this workflow would have required a dedicated Linux installation, or at least a virtual machine. Today, it happens almost invisibly. Virtualization technology has also become so efficient that many users no longer see the need for lightweight virtual machines, containerization, and hardware-assisted virtualization allow entire operating systems to run with minimal performance loss. Modern processors from Intel and AMD include virtualization features that make running Linux inside Windows or Windows inside Linux feel surprisingly smooth. Memory is cheaper, CPUs are faster, and SSDs eliminate much of the storage bottleneck that once made virtualization impractical. Gaming, traditionally, the biggest reason to stay on Windows is changing to Valve's investment in Proton has transformed Linux gaming. Thousands of Windows games now work on Linux with little or no configuration. The Steam Deck, which runs Linux, has demonstrated that gamers don't necessarily need Windows to enjoy modern titles. While Windows still has advantages in compatibility and anti-cheat support, the gap continues to shrink every year. Artificial intelligence is creating another unexpected point of convergence. AI development relies heavily on Linux-based tools, yet many developers prefer Windows for productivity, thanks to WSL and GPU pastoral support. AI researchers can train models using Linux environments while still enjoying the convenience of Windows applications. NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and Microsoft have all invested heavily in making this hybrid workflow as seamless as possible. They still have fundamentally different philosophies. Linux remains open source, community-driven, highly customizable, and available in countless distributions. Windows remains proprietary, commercially managed, and focused on broad consumer compatibility. System administration, package management, security models, and licensing are still very different. The identities of the two operating systems remain intact. However, what is changing is the user's experience. Increasingly, people don't care which kernel is running beneath their applications. They care whether their software works efficiently. Developers want their terminals, gamers want their games, creators want their editing software, and businesses want reliable infrastructure. If these needs can be satisfied without rebooting into another operating system, dual booting naturally becomes less attractive. There are still situations where dual booting makes perfect sense. Some users need complete hardware access, maximum gaming performance, specialized drivers, or security isolation. Linux enthusiasts often enjoy using Linux as their primary desktop rather than simply accessing Linux tools. Likewise, some enterprise applications still require native Windows installations, but its role is changing. Instead of being the default recommendation for anyone wanting both Windows and Linux, it is becoming a niche solution for advanced users with very specific requirements for millions of developers, students, engineers, and hobbyists. The ability to use Linux directly inside Windows or Windows applications alongside Linux environments has eliminated one of the biggest reasons to maintain two separate operating systems. Looking ahead, this trend will likely continue. Better virtualization, improved container technologies, cloud-native development, AI-powered work. Microsoft has every incentive to improve Linux integration because developers demand it. Linux benefits by becoming more accessible to Windows users who might never have installed a separate distribution. Both ecosystems gain from cooperation rather than competition. So, is this truly the end of dual booting? Probably not. There will always be enthusiasts who want complete control over their hardware and users who prefer a fully native Linux or Windows experience. But for the average user, the necessity of rebooting between operating systems is fading away. What once required careful disk partitioning, bootloader configuration, and technical expertise can now be accomplished with a simple terminal command or a lightweight virtual environment. In a surprising twist that few could have predicted decades ago, Windows and Linux are no longer fighting for exclusive control of your computer. Instead, they are quietly learning to coexist, complement each other's strengths, and provide users with the best of both worlds. The future may not belong to Windows or Linux alone. It may belong to a computing experience where the boundaries between them become so seamless that most users stop thinking about which operating system they are actually using.